Stacie. We've been married for about 15 years, and we have 2 children, a couple of girls, ages 9 and 11. We attended Marriage Corps about 8 years ago as participants and decided to continue on afterward as facilitators, so we've been doing that ever since. We, even with 7 years of marriage ministry under our belts and the previous year of going through Marriage Corps, we're still here. We're still working on our marriage together and with other folks who are beginning to understand or who already understand and just want to improve. Beginning to understand the importance that God has placed on the marriage covenant. So that's really what we're talking about, and we're going to address this in a little bit of a specific way here. Stacie will continue the introduction.
So we're going to focus on a verse that is not specifically a marriage verse, but because it is about the way that we're supposed to relate to other people in general, it should obviously apply within the context of our marriage. So it's Colossians 3:12 through 15. It says, "So as those who have been chosen of God, holy and beloved, put on a heart of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, bearing with one another and forgiving each other, whoever has a complaint against anyone, just as the Lord forgave you, so also should you. Beyond all these things put on love, which is the perfect bond of unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body, and be thankful." So we're going to go through this one attribute at a time and discuss, what that really looks like in the context of marriage, along with a little bit of a definition of that. So the first one being compassion. The Study Bible defined compassion as concern and love, and I wanted a little bit more, so I went to the dictionary, and the dictionary says, "A feeling of deep sympathy and sorrow for another who is stricken by misfortune, accompanied by a strong desire to alleviate the suffering." So, as we discussed it, stricken by misfortune sounds pretty extreme, but it can just be something like sad or discouraged or disappointed or things like that. So those are all opportunities for us to show compassion for our spouse. Thinking of particular things within the context of marriage. So there are times when John gets a little moody or irritable. And during those times, he seems to have tunnel vision where he's really only focused on or able to see the bad, or to see things as bad that may not really be bad. So in those times, his standard responses tend to be complaining, criticism, sarcasm, or just coldness. And it would be really, really easy to, in my exasperation and frustration, to respond in like kind. What I try to do, sometimes succeed more than others, but what I try to do is try to figure out where this is coming from. Try to figure out what's prompting it. There are some standard triggers that typically are responsible for prompting that sort of behavior, and that's not to dismiss wrong behavior. That's just so that I can have an understanding of where he's coming from, maybe cut him a little bit of slack and see if there's anything that I can do to help. It's not to blame myself for anything. It's to just show kindness and compassion. It's still frustrating, but it does really help to look at it from the perspective of what's he going through, what's going on in this, and to understand that this is stemming from his actions are being driven by some deep emotions that are touching a real sore spot. So that's where that comes from. So it helps me to respond better.
So the next attribute that we are discussing is kindness. And the Study Bible definition of kindness is, kindness refers to a goodness toward others that pervades the entire person, mellowing all harsh aspects. So a pretty interesting look at kindness, and perhaps a little different than our gut reaction toward what the word kindness means. Kindness is made much easier when you have a right view of how God sees others. So similar to compassion, you need to be able to see what they're seeing and understand the trouble that they may be going through. More than just wanting to please others, I think kindness is, but rather it's a matter of the heart. And I think that goes well with the definition referring to goodness toward others that pervades the entire person. I think that's where pervading the heart is really the key. Because it's got to get in deep and has to be a part of who you are. It can't just be something you turn on and turn off at will. So for me, it's fairly natural to want to please others. So exercising kindness when other people are around and kind of wanting to be the nice guy and to be the one pleasing others is not too difficult. But in private, at home, when you're in the day-to-day grind and things just get a little bit tough sometimes, I find it a little bit more difficult to maintain that constant state of kindness throughout my whole being. So it's convicting for me to think of kindness involving mellowing all harsh aspects in me, particularly if I'm tired or worn out or frustrated or just had a long or bad day. That can really come out in the way that I interact with Stacie and with our kids. And that really highlights to me the need for the Holy Spirit to be involved in allowing kindness to pervade the entire person, to be there all the time. I don't think it's something that we can do on our own. So yeah, I think inviting the Holy Spirit to aid in that process is really critical. When I am able to practice kindness towards Stacie, our interactions are markedly different from the way they are when I fail to behave kindly. A situation that might have blown up, or at least prompted a negative response in Stacie, turns into something that is uplifting, that is beneficial, that we can look back on with joy and with worship God for, rather than looking back and being, just seeing it as an overall negative and not being able to see it as a positive. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean the outcome changes. It doesn't mean that the decisions we make in the end are any different.
Though they can be.
Though they can be. They can certainly be. But not necessarily. However, the path we take to get there, is much more pleasant and much more beneficial to our marriage.
Mm-hmm. So the next one it mentions is humility. And the Study Bible says that humility is the perfect antidote to the self-love that poisons human relationships. There are times when John and I are having an argument or a discussion that takes a sharp turn south, and my natural knee-jerk response is to be defensive. God's been convicting me of the need for humility in those situations and causing me to question if my defensiveness is because my pride was wounded by what John said or by the way that he said it. Sometimes the topic that's up for debate is one that John is more knowledgeable about, or he has a better understanding of it. And just because I'm hurt or offended by what he said or the way he said it, that doesn't mean that I should be dismissive of his point or throw the baby out with the bathwater and disregard it. So oftentimes my defensiveness does stem from wounded pride, but I need to be humble enough to accept correction or a challenge to my way of thinking, even if it wasn't communicated the right way.
So our next one is gentleness, and the definition we'll work off of is meekness, a willingness to suffer insult or injury rather than to inflict. So this is another one that hits home for me. For as long as I can remember, I have been prone to using sarcasm and sometimes biting or critical words and phrases in the way I interact with others. And sometimes it's meant to be just lighthearted and purely in jest. It's a form of comedy for me, or part of my humor, my sense of humor. But then other times, and there's kind of a gray area in between, I would say as well, Other times it can be kind of a nasty, insulting, barbed comment instead of just lighthearted and in jest. So I'm reminded of Proverbs 15:1, which says, "A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." And this has proven accurate in our marriage for sure. Far too many times I have made a less than gentle comment that may have been met with anger or defensiveness from my usually sweet-tempered wife. And on the other hand, gentle words spoken on the same topic, so the same topic we're discussing, the same situation, if I approach it with gentleness instead of with anger or frustration, it can come out completely differently. It'll have a totally different response from Stacie, and the outcome, just like we discussed with kindness, the outcome can be the same. We may come to the same decision, but the outcome, at least the process of which we get there, is and really the long-term outcome, I would say, is far greater, because she knows that I have come to her out of a spirit of gentleness instead of out of anger, and that makes all the difference in the world. So looking back again at the definition we started with, I also have to admit that I don't always do things, or I don't do well with suffering insult or injury. I am more likely to be the inflictor than the sufferer. And if I suffer an insult or injury, I'm more likely to by nature, my natural response is going to be to throw it back, to offer that insult back with interest. Not the right way to do it, of course. And maybe this is more of a male-oriented desire, but for myself, I love to be right. Doesn't matter what the topic is, I want to be right. And my way, of course, is the right way. There's no arguing that. I'm the man of the house, I make the rules, so I am always right. The problem is, of course, that I am not God. And because of that, I am not actually always right, believe it or not. The problem is, of course, that... Or no, sorry, I read that already. Apologies, going through the notes here. And when the fact is pointed out to me that I'm not right, that I legitimately am not right, no matter how much I think I'm right or I want to be right, it hurts. It injures my pride. And then my response to that is a selfish desire to deflect that injury onto others. Well, it's not just my pride that was hurt, it's your pride because you did this and that caused me to think this. And anyway, just a downward spiral from there, and does not end well. What I should be doing is meekly accepting the truth, suffering that injury to my pride or to my manliness, and being okay with accepting that from my wife, or from others for that matter. When I choose to respond with gentleness, it opens the door to forgiveness and peace, which are two things we'll talk about after we're here, rather than the bitterness and resentment that comes out of wanting to inflict that injury or insult back. The next one here, I'll continue on, and it's really related to, all these are interrelated very heavily. I think there's quite a good reason they're in the same passage, in the same part of Scripture. Pardon me. So the next one is patience, or bearing with one another. And the definition we'll use is long-suffering, or opposite of quick anger, resentment, or revenge. You know that one thing that just drives you up the wall? Your pet peeve, the area of weakness in your spouse that you have been trying to fix for years, but it never seems to improve. I know I've got a few of those, and Stacie does, I'm sure, as well. What do you feel like doing when that topic comes up? Or when the evidence of that failure to change or failure to fix your spouse is staring you right in the face? I know for other people, certainly not for me, of course, they may be experiencing feelings of resentment, of anger, of frustration, maybe even hopelessness. Okay, so maybe I felt a few of those things as well. I'm not quite immune to that. But that's what comes out of, I think, seeing the weaknesses in others. especially when they're things that try your patience. 15 years of marriage have taught me that my wife and kids will always do things that drive me nuts. And some of those things will be negative, others will just be differences in personality, or in capabilities, or in or interest, just not having a common interest in something. I know for us, I have a stronger interest in things of a technical or mechanical nature than Stacie does. So when we have conversations about that, it's very easy for me to get frustrated that, why aren't you understanding this? Why does this not make sense to you?
Or why does this not interest you?
Right. Yeah, I mean, doesn't it make sense that you should be interested in how a car works if you drive a car? Well, obviously that's not the case, but for me it is, so it's natural for me to want to see that in others. Okay. The differences are the hardest to me, rather than the negative interactions. So things when there's something different in the way Stacie does things, or sees something, or understands something than I do, that can be the most frustrating for me. I think it's because they happen more often with Stacie than they do with others, or maybe that I have different expectations for Stacie than I would for others. If I'm at work with a coworker, I have a certain expectation that you'll understand an issue or various aspects of something that we're working together to solve. With Stacie, I tend to put that same expectation without her having the expertise that would be would facilitate that expectation, or a facilitator in meeting that expectation. So I think that that makes it more difficult for me. We don't think alike, Stacie and I don't, which is pretty normal. Opposites attract and all. It's something that's very common to see in a marriage partnership relationship here. But it's still frustrating to me because there are a lot of times where I'd love to be able to be on the same wavelength, to talk the same, speak the same language, but it just doesn't happen like that. But regardless of that, regardless of what the issue is, I am still called to be patient. And it takes practice, it takes hard work, it takes a willingness to persevere through failures and mistakes there. And that's something I'm pretty good at, is failing in this area. But we've got to keep going, keep trying, and get to the point where it becomes habitual, it becomes part of my new nature, rather than just letting the old nature keep its foothold. So I don't have it figured out yet, but I probably never will this side of heaven. I think there will always be something I'm working on. If I don't, I think, well, I probably need to find a new way to make money off of it, but I don't think that's going to happen. I think I'll always fail. However, each success does bring a new reward, and it's always worthwhile.
Mm-hmm. So the next one is forgiveness. I view forgiveness as releasing something to God. It's something that has to be done with little everyday things and big, very painful things. When I forgive, I'm leaving any punishment up to God. I won't hold it against John as a debt he owes me. With the little things, I try to release it, even if John hasn't asked for forgiveness. He may not even realize that he's said or done something that would require forgiveness. But I need to release it so that it doesn't breed resentment or bitterness in me. When it comes to the big things, it requires, in order to be able to forgive, I have to trust that God's got my back and that He will take care of me and the situation, so that I don't need to take matters into my own hands to get my own form of justice. God, in His justice, will deal with it in His own way and His own timing. Forgiveness also doesn't automatically mean restoration, but that's a much longer, trickier topic that we don't have time to get into right now. The next thing it says is that love is the perfect bond of unity. So beyond everything else that we just mentioned, put on love, because it's the perfect bond of unity. And the Study Bible says, supernatural love poured into the hearts of believers is the adhesive of the church. And I think this highlights that love is more than just a feeling. So a lot of people dwell on the feeling aspect of it, but the feeling isn't always there. And what God calls us to is an action. It's a verb. He calls us to demonstrate love whether we feel it or not. It is a choice that we make.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I like the term that they use in the verse, put on love. It's not allow love to exist. It's not feel love. It's not that. It's put on love. It's an active process. Our clothes don't just jump on us in the morning. We have to put them on. Going back to other places in the Bible where it references the armor of God. We are putting on the breastplate of righteousness. We are putting on the belt of truth, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Sword of truth.
Belt of truth.
Belt of truth. Anyway, we're putting things on at that point. So it's an active process. It takes work. It takes effort, just like all of these do. And we've discussed that already, that it's not just something that happens. We're fighting our nature. We're fighting our sin nature in this. We're having to work through these issues. We're having to build habits. We're having to change what we would do if we were just not thinking about anything and just cruising through life. Some of us have different weaknesses. Some of us do better with some of these than others would, just without really trying. But all of them, to some degree, take effort. They take work, and I think love kind of encompasses all of these as well. Mm-hmm. If you're not showing patience, it's hard to show love through a situation that demands patience. If you're not showing kindness, it's hard to show love in a situation that demands kindness. So it's all linked, it's all wrapped up into this concept of love, and I think that's why there's so much focus put on love. It's important to understand also that, as I mentioned, some people have a harder time with certain aspects than others. So, as a rule, men in a marriage may have a more difficult time naturally expressing love to their spouse. We communicate more with grunts, with actions, with other aspects of relationship. But the love part of it doesn't come as naturally to us macho types. Not that I'm specifically a macho type, but to us men in general.
Yeah.
Whereas
it's not your primary language.
Right. Whereas with women, I think there's a more natural outflowing of love and just their bearing, the way they act. Mm-hmm. For the most part, there are always exceptions to this, but for the most part, that's what we observe in relationships. Is that the woman is more likely to be the one who expresses herself in love, and the man is not as likely to have that be a natural part of how we act.
Well, and male or female, the reason that it tells us these things, implicit in it, in the Bible telling us these things, is that it will be a struggle. You don't have to practice patience. It's not patience if you're not being tried. Mm-hmm. If it's not difficult, then it's not patience.
True.
So, with all of these things, it implies that it's going to be challenging, and that despite the challenge, we need to do that anyway. The last thing it talks about is the peace of Christ ruling in our hearts, and the Study Bible mentions that as referring to two things: God's calling us to salvation and causing us to be at peace with Him, and the attitude of rest or security. And I think this, with the peace of Christ, I think it goes back to Philippians, I think it's 4:19, where it says, "Be anxious for nothing, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of Christ, or the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." So it's when we are surrendered to God's will, when we are surrendered to His will and His way, and we trust Him, we are releasing the situation to Him, we are choosing to be thankful in all things, that's when that supernatural peace comes. And when we have that peace, it feeds these other actions. It's much easier for us to show kindness and compassion toward our spouse when it's difficult. If we have that peace of Christ that doesn't make sense, if we're peaceful in the midst of challenging circumstances, that only comes from God. So it's that kind of deep, deep peace that defies human understanding, that's supposed to be ruling in our hearts and enabling all of this. So.
Yeah, and what came to mind when I thought of the peace of Christ here is that there's this odd juxtaposition between the peace coming entirely from Christ and not being something that we create or generate somehow, but at the same time it takes effort and action from us to kind of accept that peace and to allow God's peace to take hold in our lives. So it's an odd thing, where we're not working for salvation, for example. So that side of the peace of Christ, we're not working for. There's nothing we can do, of course. And in the same sense, we're not working for God's peace in our lives, but we still have to allow it to happen. We can make our lives crazy. we can absolutely reject the peace of Christ if we want to. So there's still an action on our part to allow that, and I think that's important to understand, that it's not just that the peace is just going to come out of nothing that we
the peace comes by submitting ourselves to God and by understanding that He's in control of all things and surrendering that to Him, being thankful. I think based on what Philippians says, that's where the peace comes from. So that's our part, that if we aren't doing those things, we are not going to experience peace. So
so I think it's been neat to look through this list and realize how all of this it's all interconnected. You don't get one without the other. They all take work, but they are all integral parts of having a successful and peaceful, healthy, joyful marriage. So we want to encourage you in that, and I hope that's what you can take away from this. And feel free to have your own, spend your own time looking through these attributes and coming up with new links and how everything fits together and how you can put that into action in your own lives. Yep. So until next time, we'll see you all later.
All right, practice these attributes.